Hello, everyone, and welcome to Metaphysical Media with Stephen and Steve. I'm Stephen Lewis, and I have here with me my good friend and colleague, Stephen Frampton. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing well, thank you, Stephen, very well. It's good to be back into the swing of things after the holidays.
That's right. I hope you had a great New Year. I hope everybody else had a nice New Year celebration, and I hope everyone has a nice 2015. Today, on today's edition of Metaphysical Media, we're going to use a very powerful branch of astrology called horary, which is kind of a funny name, Steve. Horary. For our listeners, I'll just delve briefly into a little bit of etymology here. It comes from the word hora, which means hour. So it deals with asking a question. It's a purely divinatory astrology, Steve, where you ask a question, you cast a chart for the time and the place that you're asking the question and the time, of course, and you get an answer from that chart. And I use it a lot in my practice, Steve. I love it. You use it yourself, and today we're going to apply it to a mundane question, Steve. We're going to talk about France and their possible sale of Mistral warships to Russia. So how do you feel about that, Steve?
Well, it's something I'm very interested in because we've talked a lot about Russia, Stephen, and particularly Putin's behavior and policies. We've had a number of shows about Russia and the international relations with Russia in 2014. And I did half of my first degree in France. I lived in France and have family there, and I go there pretty much every year. So I'm very familiar with the culture and the country. So it's very interesting for me to consider this ethical dilemma that France finds itself in.
Yeah, they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, and that's one reason the question intrigued me. And Steve, that's really important to the doctrine of horary, that the question sort of eat at you a little bit. What you read it constantly is that the querent, which is sort of like a technical term for those listening who might not know what a querent is, the technical term for someone asking a question. The querent really, the asker should really be bothered by the question, In order for the chart to have any force, any power to describe and answer their question, then the person has to be legitimately moved. Those give the sharpest answers. And, this is a question that I've been sort of pondering for quite a long time now. Where does France stand, and are they going to sell Russia these warships, and what are the consequences of this sale going to be? Because let's face it, Steve, I think Russia is making everybody nervous today.
Oh, for sure, and Putin particularly. We live in a very uncertain time, and personally, I would say that some of Russia's choices have been absolutely outrageous. In less civilized times, there would have been absolute warfare over Russia's annexation of Crimea. So this is a very important question, and we know from our research already about the latter part of this decade, the 2020s, that we're moving in some troublesome times, and we've seen indications that there are really problematic dynamics for the US and for Russia. So the big question is, well, are they at each other's throats, or what will be going on at the end of this decade and in the 2020s? So this is a really important question, and it's a great example, Stephen, of how what's occurring today becomes history, but is absolutely involved with whatever comes later.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that horary astrology in particular sort of is almost like among the oldest types of astrology, I would say. It's certainly very ancient. It has an application in mundane affairs. So in other words, it's great for people wanting to ask questions about their own personal fortunes, but we can also use horary for mundane questions such as this, and we'll probably be using it in the future to answer a lot of questions, especially for our criminological source of work, for finding missing people, for addressing unsolved cases, also for dealing with politics. well, I'm sure we'll have some shows coming up in the future speculating about the pending presidential elections in 2016. Horary is very well suited for those.
Yes,
but tonight,
even just, I know, a little tangent, but Jeb Bush has announced that he hasn't announced, but he's cutting back on different commitments, which is an indication that he's going to run.
Yeah, he's sort of, the war drums are kind of beating here. So those will all be interesting questions that we will pose to Horary. But today, what we have on our plate is this pending transaction between France and Russia, and we have a chart for that. We posed the question just for the purposes of this show to make it fresh as possible, just a few minutes ago. I'll give you guys the data. The date for the chart is January the 2nd, 2015. The time would be 9:53:41 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that would be for New Bern, North Carolina. And you know what? Use whatever house system you like, because I'm not too picky about house systems. That might sound kind of weird, Steve. I switch routinely between whole sign houses in either Porphyry, Placidus, or Alcobaceous houses. But really, it doesn't really, I don't think it matters hugely the house custom system that one uses. But those are the data for the chart, Steve, and you've had a few minutes, I suppose, to look at it. It's kind of a cold read here, but may I ask some of your initial impressions about this chart?
Well, let me say first of all, Stephen, that I have a lot of respect for France. It's a nation that I'm very fond of, and I like to think that regardless of finances, we would do the right thing, or France would do the right thing. And so I was hoping when we ran this chart that I'd have an image in front of me that makes me feel France would do the right thing. But I would say my first observation looking at this chart, and you may say you feel something very different, but my first observation when I see this chart is, maybe they will. Mm-hmm. Maybe they will sell a warship to Russia. There are some indications in this chart that the situation is very complex and that there are significant risks here. Not only that selling a warship to Russia could be a problem that hits us in future, but indications that France may choose to do so. What's your first feel as you look at the charts?
Wow. Well, I look at the fact that we have a mutable sign rising, and all the angles are in mutable signs. I think that's important because that'll give us an idea of the results, the outcome of this whole thing. If we had fixed sign on these angles, then I would say, wow, the results of this deal are going to be permanent. It's going to result in some sort of a permanent type of alliance. But with the sign on the ascendant, and midheaven, the descendant, and the angle of the earth, the fourth house, with these signs being mutable, it tells me that the results of this whole saga, and we still haven't even addressed the question of whether it's going to happen or not yet, really, but the results of this are going to be perhaps doubled, split off, or repeated somehow. So, you know what I'm thinking, Steve? It looks to me almost as if there are going to be repeated payments made to France, because from my perspective, with Virgo rising, Leo in the 12th house, I'm going to, the question arises now, who represents what in the chart? What sign is going to be France? What sign is going to be Russia? Now, because we're asking about France, I'm going to adopt a point of view, and this is a point of view that I might likely, switch out for another one. I mean, I like to retain maximum flexibility when analyzing horary charts. I think that sort of flexibility is absolutely vital to getting at what the chart's trying to tell you. But for the moment, let's assume that Virgo rising is a significator for France, and Pisces is their partners, their enemies, their seventh house personages. Makes sense as well, the mutability of Pisces. Multiple diplomatic partners are impinging upon this transaction. So that makes sense. The ruler of that house, Jupiter, which is in the 12th.
Yeah.
This is typically not a good configuration.
No, I agree completely. That the fact that the seventh, because in effect, the whole consideration here is France, the ascendant, Virgo, as you said, partnering with or trading with another party, in that case, Russia. Russia, therefore, being the seventh, and the ruler being in the 12th. I think that on one hand says to us that this is a very unknown quantity for France. The French may, or the French authorities, French decision makers, the government may be thinking that they can get a clear handle on the dynamics of this consideration, this relationship, this potential trade with Russia. But the fact that the ruler, the traditional ruler of Pisces, is in the 12th, suggests that the French are never really going to know the full story or full intentions of the Russian government. Do you agree with that point?
I definitely agree with that point. The 12th having traditional connotations of secrecy and hiddenness. It definitely makes me think there's going to be some sort of shadowy or secret type of transaction. Even if they don't sell the warships to Russia, they're going to make up for it somehow. But I suspect that that sale is going to continue as planned, because the finances of this chart seem to be set up very nicely for France, with Venus, Lady of the Second House, trining the rising degree. That's the North Node, increasing income in the second house. The second house itself being in Libra, the sign of relationship and the sign of business transaction.
Yeah.
Stephen, and it's retrograde.
I know that we were talking a while ago, Stephen, about the physical characteristics of different signs of the zodiac. And I smiled when I looked at this chart, because we said, well, Pisces indicates Russia. And I always memorize that Pisces in itself tends towards shortness and a paler complexion. And I always remember fishy eyes. Pisces is a sign of fish, but I always remember memorizing fishy eyes. And when you think of that, tended shortness, pale complexion, fishy eyes, who do you think of? Putin. It's just quite fascinating. But I agree with you that there's a lot of financial consideration in this chart, and we should definitely look at that, because clearly a huge consideration for the French here is the size of the transaction, the value of the transaction.
I got to tell you something too, Steve. I mean, I think that it might not be just liquid cash that's at stake here. Virgo is a forested sign. It's very agricultural. France, let's face it, France is kind of a toxic dump. It's kind of an urban wasteland. In other words, it could be strapped for resources. France is not exactly tripping over itself in terms of uranium and gold and other precious things. You know what I'm saying? It has to import a lot of resources. So it could be. And Russia, but due to its very cunning diplomatic posturing and its alliances with China and the BRICS consortium, Russia is going to be posturing itself so that it has access to lots of raw materials and resources. And so I'm thinking that it could be that France is going to benefit in terms of these things. I mean, the rising degree, 12 degrees of Virgo, is in the term of Venus, the bound, the confine, that little section of Virgo that belongs to Venus. And, Venus represents money, represents also, luxury types of resources and women, and also Islam and religious things. And it's usually very benefic, represents the finer things in life to have the ascendant there. It kind of shows that, these are the confines or the boundaries of what this question is about, the confines of France's motivation for even wanting the deal in the first place. We have to ask ourselves, why would France even consider such a deal with Russia in the first place?
Well, it's a huge, it's an enormous transaction. And, France has generally speaking, France has a pretty healthy economy, but part of the context here is that when the 2008 crisis hit us, many nations took very difficult decisions and introduced austerity measures. There was a lot of debate about whether that was or is the right thing to do. If you look at the terrible situation in Greece and Portugal and Spain, is very sad as well. You've got something like 40-50% of people under 30 that have never worked. So it's a massive generational problem that's not going to go away. And the challenge with the French economy is that although they're pretty well diversified economically, they didn't take the pain following 2008. France is generally a very socialist nation, and they increased taxes. They didn't do the things that they should have done to correct their economy. So what you've got really, Stephen, I think in Europe is you've got countries like Spain, Portugal and Greece that are really suffering because they took the pain, they had no choice. The UK took a fair amount of pain, but its situation wasn't as bad as, say, Mediterranean nations like Portugal, Spain, and Greece. But the UK, nonetheless, they took the tough decisions, and they're seeing some recovery. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as it should be or could be, but they're seeing some recovery. But the French have got this sort of delayed economic effect because they didn't take the pain, which I think presents a problem when it comes to this sort of situation with an enormous transaction like this, because they're not going to have as much flexibility as they might like to have when it comes to their pocketbook. So it could lead the French to make a choice that perhaps we wouldn't under different circumstances. And your observation about Venus, the role of the finances in this chart, being so closely associated with the rule of the ascendant France, which is Virgo, Mercury in the fifth house. That's a very, very good point, Stephen, because Mercury and Capricorn conjunct in Capricorn in the fifth house, with Venus ruling the finances in the chart, Mercury ruling the ascendant. That says to me that the French want to do this deal. They want to find a way to make this deal work, to make this deal acceptable to the international community and go ahead.
Yeah, I got to tell you something, man. It seems to me as if the people, and I could, I don't know, I mean, I'm not in France. I haven't really been following the press on this issue, even though I'm curious about whether, whether the deal will go through or not. But it seems to me as if the people are kind of behind this deal of France, and maybe there's some national pride going on, like, the rest of Europe is going to tell us what to do. I'm guessing at this, speculating at this, but
well, France is the French. I love the French people. I love the French nation. But they are traditionally quite anti-British. I mean, in the civilized way, but they are really even more anti-United States. So,
yeah.
So the British tend to toe the line. That's interesting. It's an interesting expression, given that we're talking about a ship. So, but the British tend to toe the line. It takes a lot for the British to state that they're in disagreement with the United States. France, it's not quite the same, and so it is more acceptable, more commonplace to do their own thing and not be so not controlled, but not be so influenced by U.S. policy. Because if this was Britain, you'd probably find that they just wouldn't do it. They damage their relationship with the US. They wouldn't want to do that. French have got a little more wriggle room. And I think, Stephen, as well, you made the excellent point about the angles in the charts, and it's important for our listeners. They should know that if they're working with astrology, they should always look at the angles of the chart. Are they cardinal, mutable, fixed, or cardinal, fixed, mutable, I should say. And in this case, they're mutable. This means as well that it says to me that the French probably want to sort of find a way to wriggle their way through this to make it work somehow, because that mutability on the angle says to me that they're kind of unsure. They'd like to find a way. They'll try to find a way to make this acceptable.
I'm inclined. I'm definitely inclined to agree, Steve. I think they're going to adapt to the situation because what's important here is that they desire relationships with Russia, and they'll have them. I'm pretty sure of that. With Mercury ruling the ascendant at 27, Mercury's place is at 27 degrees Capricorn, so he's ruled by his sign ruler is Saturn, and Mercury is in the bound of Mars. He's in that little. It's just a few degrees section of Capricorn that Mars rules over, and at the very end, very tail end of Capricorn, Mercury's in it, and Mashallah, in his The Significations of Planets, written hundreds of years ago, says that for natives, this isn't really horary astrology he's talking about, but it's interesting to sort of bring in those concepts. He says that people with Mercury in the terms or the bounds of Mars, their works are not good. Now here we're talking about France. If we assign France to the first house, which is Virgo rising, Mercury rules Virgo, and Mercury is in the 27th degree of Capricorn, trining the ascendant degree. And here Masha'Allah bin Athari, a Persian Jewish astrologer, who elected the building of the city of Baghdad. He was an astrologer who was commissioned by a caliph to elect the laying of the cornerstone for the foundation of Baghdad. So you know a thing or two about astrology. His observation of behavioral characteristics when Mercury is posited in the confines of Mars is that the person's works are not good. The entity is always going to be desirous because of pain. Discord is always going to come from the entity. And interestingly, Mashallah observes that the entity will go to bed with its own offspring. I don't know how we would fit this in to this situation, but I'm sure incestuous relations, probably we would not have to use much imagination to speculate how incest, financial incest or something could apply to this situation. Indeed, there might be quite a bit of incestuous finances that are underlying this deal, Steve. What do you think about that?
Well, I think great observations, and certainly that incestuous indication is another testimony to the fact that France is most likely to go ahead with this. But your point about the finances is an important one, and because you've got the North Node in the second house in this chart, it means France wants the money. France, it really wants this transaction to go ahead financially, and they want to find a way to make it acceptable. Again, Mercury and Venus in Capricorn conjunct in the fifth. But you see you've got the South Node of the Moon in the eighth house of the other party's finances, or Russia's finances. I think that this chart is saying to us that there are very significant financial considerations here for France that don't just relate to the value of this particular contract, that there's potentially other pain that Russia could cause France financially. And that's one thing I'd say. But the other thing that's intriguing me is that the eighth house cusp is ruled by Mars, and we've got Mars in fixed air and Aquarius in the sixth house. And the sixth house is the cusp of it's Aquarius. We've got Saturn, Uranus, Mars involved in this house, and Neptune as well, interestingly, which in modern terms is the ruler of the sea rather than Jupiter. But that collection of Mars in the sixth being ruled by malefic Saturn and Uranus, and modern ruler of the sea, Neptune, being in the sixth. And this says to me that this is likely to go ahead as well, because the sixth is my understanding is that the sixth is the Navy. It is seafaring. It's the Army, the Navy, etc. So that's another testimony in my mind that says this is likely to go ahead.
Outstanding observation. Your comments about Mars were pretty much extremely accurate and descriptive. And in fact, for the benefit of our listeners, I would like to point out that in this particular chart, Mars has an extraordinary amount of power and dignity. Aside from his placement in the sixth house, now the listener might be looking at this chart and saying, how on earth can Mars have any kind of puissance, any kind of potency at all? it's in the 6th house. It should be drained of force. But Mars's importance to this chart lies in its rulerships. Mars has considerable rulership over the Sun because Mars is exalted in Capricorn. You see, Mars, in fact, is exalted in Capricorn, and it has a triplicity rulership in Capricorn, which means that it has a special power in the earth element, and the Sun is in the earth element. And also the Sun happens to be in the decan. Well, okay, not of Mars. Yeah, he's squeaking by. It's at 12 degrees Capricorn. The Sun is in the decan of Mars. So Mars has a lot of power over the Sun. Mars also has a lot of power over the lot of fortune, right, which is in Aries. Mars is the ruler of the part of fortune. Mars also is it has a lot of influence over the prenatal lunation, which was 0 degrees 7 minutes of Capricorn. So my point is that, for the listener to understand, Mars is in fact the significator of the entire chart. It is the answer to the horary question. Why is this happening? What's going to be the result of it? Mars is your answer. Mars signifies why Russia wants the warships. Mars signifies why why we're even having this question to begin with. So now we look at Mars's placement in the 6th house, which, obviously ain't good. The 6th house is traditionally quite challenging. It represents people that, believe it or not, dislike you. It's a house of enemies. It's also a house of the armed forces, as you very appropriately pointed out. But the good thing about this chart is that it's a nocturnal chart. It's very cool. It's very moist, and it's going to counteract the crudity and the rashness of Mars, and it's going to notch those energy levels down to something a lot more tolerable. So it's also going to prevent France and Russia from acting rashly on this, and it's going to facilitate subterfuge. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a substantial amount of subterfuge. I think some deal is going to happen because of the applying sextile between the Moon and Jupiter, and also because of the trine from Mercury to its ascending degree, and also because of the characteristics of Mars, Jupiter, and even Neptune. I think France is trying to say to the world that they're not sleeping with the devil here, but even if they don't sell the warships to Russia, they're going to do something to make Mother Russia happy. They're going to placate Putin somehow. And they're going to be rewarded.
I think, they will, Stephen, but I feel that they're very much, I feel that the chart's saying that they'll very much regret their choice in the long term. And one of the things that I was considering is that, nearly all the planets in this chart are moving rapidly. So the Sun is fast right now, Mercury is fast, Venus is fast, that very determined Mars in Aquarius is fast. Saturn is fast, Neptune is fast, Pluto is fast, and so I feel like they want to speed their way to a decision and outcome, and that the chart is saying not only does France not have the full picture, and probably will never have the full picture, but both parties want to quickly resolve this. And that means that they may not take the time that's required to reach the right decision. But also, Stephen, I was thinking that, when I look at a person, when I'm seeing a client, or I'm looking at, say, for example, a case study that we do on a killer or a public figure, I always look at the 3rd house as part of my consideration about the mentality of the entity, and particularly, if you're looking at an individual, considering, is there any mental illness? Well, I feel uncomfortable when I see a water sign, and particularly the fixed water sign Scorpio on the cusp of the 3rd house of mentality, because in my mind, the water on the 3rd house indicates a predisposition towards some imbalance mentally, or imbalance in terms of thought process and decision making. But also we've got Saturn in there, so I'm not feeling particularly good about France's thought process. But the real shocker for me, the real nasty kicker in this chart, is that we've got the nodes of the moon at 14 degrees in cardinal signs. We've got 14 degrees Libra, cardinal north node in the second house of finances. And then we've got the south node, 14 degrees Aries, in the eighth house of finances. And squaring that nodal axis, we've got both the Sun, which rules the 12th house in the chart, Sun in Capricorn, and Pluto. Now, Pluto, modern astrology, obviously, is the ruler of Scorpio along with Mars, so therefore it's involved with the third house of mentality and decision-making, in my opinion. But that's really alarming, seeing the Sun and Pluto squaring the nodes, particularly when transiting Uranus is up at the south node, therefore squaring that point. This is a very tense chart, and really, if this were a client, say you had somebody call in and ask us about a decision they want to make, I feel that if this is the chart we ran for that client in response to that question, I'd be saying to them, well, just take a vacation, don't even try and make a decision with it. Just leave it for now, don't push this, wait. If you push it now, you can make a disastrous decision, or don't make a decision that's going to make you unpopular, and it's going to bite you in the ass in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the water sign that's on the third house cusp. If you consider the third house, as you pointed out, the house of communications and everything, and we're talking about naval resources here. So to have Scorpio, the de facto sign of naval warfare, to be on the third house cusp is, I think, extremely appropriate. In fact, I would posit that perhaps Saturn in Sagittarius is in fact a significator for the Warship itself, in the sense that it's a sixth house item. Some modern astrologers that I respect, Charles Harvey, Michael Bagan, Nicholas Campion, they posited, if I'm not mistaken, that not only does the sixth house deal with armed forces, but also with military hardware and things of that sort. So we could perhaps see Saturn in that context as the ship itself, or perhaps even Venus being a second house type of an entity, a movable possession. However, Venus is too light of a planet for me to feel good about her being a symbol for the Warship, even though she is in the sign of a heavy planet. She's in Capricorn, and Capricorn's ruled by Saturn. Saturn's very heavy. So Venus might be an alternate symbol for the Warship if Saturn doesn't quite work out. But quite frankly, I'm thinking Saturn is a decent symbol because, for one thing, Saturn is quite aquatic in his own way. I mean, we're talking about a doctrine that goes back even before the Middle Ages.
This is interesting, and you mentioned this, Stephen. I think you mentioned this in an email to me, and I probably only responded. Well, you mentioned this point that Aquarius, which is a sign that's of particular interest to me because it's my most powerful sign. But I know that when I teach astrology, I have to really hammer it home. Aquarius is an air sign. Aquarius is not a water sign. Because you think of Aquarius, you think of aqueducts, etc. You logically you would say, well, it's probably a water sign, but it's not. It's an air sign. So you sent me an email some time ago saying, oh yes, the ancients considered Aquarius to be a water sign. And it struck a chord with me because of this sort of struggle at times with people that are new to astrology and having them memorize that Aquarius is an air sign, not a water sign. But also the consideration of it being a water sign, it just really resonates with me. It's not, my reaction is not, oh, that's nonsense, or that doesn't make sense. My reaction is, there's something very, very valid, very interesting about that point. Now, I don't know of myself why it was considered a water sign and then changed to an air sign. So it's a question I asked you in the email. I guess I've somehow hijacked you because I want to understand from you, and I'm sure our listeners do as well, well, why was this so and why did it change?
Well, a lot of the logic behind these pronouncements are meteorological in nature. When the sun is transiting through Aquarius, this is often the moistest part of the winter with the most precipitation, a lot of snow, and things of that nature. Also, Aquarius. Yeah, even in Babylonian times, Aquarius and Saturn were associated with the engineering of water, the restriction and confinement of water, so that it serves man, so that we have docks and harbors and things of that nature. And this is why laymen associate Aquarius with the water sign, because of the water. They associate it with the water bearer, and so Aquarius actually began its life belonging to the water element instead of the air element. It was only later that it became an air sign, and now it still has a highly aquatic flavor to it. And so Saturn, I think is a fairly decent symbol for the Mistral warship in the sense that it's aquatic and also it's weighty. It represents a fortress in the water. That's very Saturnian, and it's in the fourth house of the end of the matter. I'm thinking that probably signifies that maybe it signifies them being docked in France, even though Sagittarius is far away. Maybe France has them docked at one of their ancient colonial ports, maybe in South Pacific somewhere, far away from prying European eyes. Britain, historically, ever since the days probably of Ptolemy, has been attributed to Aries. And so we see Aries on the 8th house of this chart, and we can instantly understand how Britain's position as insofar as this deal is concerned. We got the South Node in there. We've got Uranus there. We've also got the part of fortune there. It's ruled by Mars. We've already talked about Mars and his importance in this chart as a significator. Britain, I think, would be quite anxious over this deal.
Oh, for sure. And there have been a number of incursions in 2014, and it's very interesting, Stephen, because these things don't generally get into the mainstream media. You have to really dig around to find the pieces of the puzzle, and then you have to really sit and reflect on each of these different things that you discover and connect the dots to sort of figure out, well, what on earth is going on. But Russia flew military jets into Danish airspace. Into Dutch airspace, and they were chased out of Dutch airspace. They've done the same once or twice in British airspace. They've done the same with other nations. They've deliberately done the same with the United States and came very close to the west coast of the US. And then also, Stephen, the Russians, in response to sanctions, agreed that they decided with Cuba that they would create a military base in Cuba, right on the doorstep of the United States. And then lo and behold, all of a sudden we're changing our relationship with Cuba.
Oh, yeah.
And so Russia is a major problem. And I have to say, I don't normally speak highly of Prince Charles. And strictly speaking, when we say that the monarchy the British monarchy is not supposed to get involved in politics, their role is not political. But Charles was in Canada at some point last year, and he said to a lady, I think he was in some tea shop or something, and he was chatting with a Canadian lady, and he said something like, well, what Russia has just done is exactly what Putin's just done is exactly what Hitler did, annexation, and he was hit hard time by the press, and he had his knuckles wrapped for making a political statement. But actually, if I want to take my hat off to the guy, because he made a very important, very valid point. And Stephen, you mentioned the end of the matter of the fourth house, as you indicated before. Well, the ruler of the cusp is that Jupiter. That's disappointing. It's in the sign of France, Leo, and it's in the 12th house. Disappointment, sorrows, and also the Sun and Pluto are in the 4th house of endings, the end of the matter, and they square the node. So this is not good.
Yeah, I'm thinking that, Jupiter representing Russia, because, Jupiter rules Pisces on the 7th house. And in doing these horary charts where we're talking about the interaction of two entities in a relationship, a business transaction, a romantic transaction, a fight even, any kind of X versus Y dynamic, you look at the 1st and 7th house axis, and you look at the commingling and the interaction of the planets that rule those signs. And Jupiter rules the 7th house, representing Russia, and it's in the 12th. We talked about this, but it also rules the 4th. It rules the end of the matter. And to me, Steve, this suggests that Russia is going to get its way on this deal because they rule over the closing out of this issue. You see. And, the warship, I'm correct about Saturn being a symbol of the warship. It's in the 4th house, and that might signify it going to Russia. Jupiter is retrograding now. So it is swift. Absolutely, it's swift, but it's going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And I love your observations, actually, Stephen. I wanted to say to you that you sent me a couple of emails as well about the planets at the cusps and, when they're sort of being pulled in one direction and then pulled in another direction, and how that's having a very strong bearing energetically in terms of the entity or the question at hand. And I love that sort of push and pull. It's like a pendulum. It's like this concept. Do you know what I think of? Those sort of metal beams that are on strings, and you one knocks the other, and
I call them physics balls. Yeah, I don't know what they're called. I guess they're probably called Newton something, but I call them physics balls. Yeah, and now you're going to love this, then, Steve. You're talking about that's the Greek notion of phora, motion. And here, if we look at Virgo, not so much as France, but as a general symbol for the lushness of natural resources to begin with. And, if we look at Leo, it's France, the 12th house. Now, this is a little bit of sleight of hand.
Great cheese, Stephen, great wine. I've never had such good chicken, actually, and pate.
But there you go. You look at Virgo as all of these things, as opulent resources rising, and we can say that this is what the matter is really about, France getting access to resources through Russia. Then we see Jupiter moving by that phora, that motion. It's being pulled into France. So resources represented by Jupiter as a universal symbol of abundance. They're moving by the natural motion of the Earth, the diurnal rotation of the Earth. They're moving into the 12th house, into Leo, which is also a symbol for France. Now, I'm getting this part, again, from ancient precedent. This isn't usual or standard horary practice. I'm bringing in mundane astrology to bear upon this question. Leo has traditionally been choreographed to France. And so this is just, I want to demonstrate how horary can be flexible, how we can show multiple perspectives. We're not shoehorned or straitjacketed into saying that with Virgo rising, Virgo is a significator for France. Virgo can also symbolize just the general abundance of material resources. And with Jupiter moving into Leo, it's clear where the direction of those resources. Now, if we switch back to our original perspective, we see Jupiter retrograding backward. We see Saturn moving forward. They are applying by trine. This might say, okay, not only is the deal going to go through, but it's going to work out well for Russia. Here's where horary gets tricky. We have to break out the ephemeris and understand that Jupiter is going to frustrate that trine by moving forward, changing his direction. This is going to put a kink in the deal. But the deal will be consummated later when Jupiter and Saturn square each other. That would represent the consummation of the sale, and it's going to work out to the detriment of both France and Russia because that's represented by the nature of the square.
Yeah. Also, I was thinking that opposition between Jupiter in the 12th house and Mars, almost like the determination in this question. And it's very interesting it's Mars, because Mars is warfare, it is missiles. And we've got here a missile and a fixed air. So it's a very effective little thing. But the fact that we've got an opposition between fixed signs, to me, suggests that France will regret this trade for a long time if they go ahead, and it looks pretty much like they will.
Yeah, no. I think the opposition might also sort of indicate, an awareness on the part of France publicly that Russia may have used this military hardware. The opposition is separating. However, it also is, represents to me that the deal, nevertheless, that some deal is going to go on, and it's going to be secret. And, we're going to find out what happens. Jupiter will be squaring Saturn a long time from now, way down the road. It looks like they're going to trine each other because they're in fire elements but Jupiter is about to turn direct and frustrate the trine. The trine is going to be prohibited. It will not perfect. And so that's going to represent a temporary kink in the deal.
It's fascinating. It's also fascinating, Stephen, that we all know about this Pluto-Uranus square that is persisting, and the seventh square occurs in the spring, doesn't it? I think it's March, if my memory serves me correctly, but it's like the crescendo. We've also got the Saturn-Neptune square, and when you read the news and you read about all the unfortunate things that are happening at sea, particularly with human trafficking, and think of the ferry disaster, that awful ferry disaster in South Korea, the ferry disaster off the south coast of Italy last year. You thinking about this consideration regarding a ship, a warship, sea again. Think about the human trafficking, the problems with pirates at sea. So many considerations with sea, and also all this dispute about the sea between China, Japan, and I think it's Indonesia, or is it? Yeah, I think it's Indonesia. So many considerations around the sea and seafaring. So this square that's appearing between Saturn and Neptune in mutable signs, and one of them, Neptune, in its own sign, water, Pisces, says that there are going to be a lot more issues this year with sea and seafaring considerations. So that's another testimony, I think, Stephen, to the fact that there's likely to be a lot of controversy about this whole question with the warships, the sale of a warship from France to Russia. So that Neptune, what I'm saying in short is that I rambled, but that Saturn-Neptune square also says to me that this is going to be problematic. This is not just going to go away.
The Saturn-Neptune cycle has been significant for Russia ever since the early 1800s. Not only that, the entire cycle has been significant for the march and the advance of European socialism and communism. So I'm thinking that as pertains to this question, and the evolution of Russian governance and culture, etc., when the conjunction between Saturn and Neptune happens, this is going to mark out another main phase in this cycle of socialism. That's what I would expect. The Russian Revolution in 1917 quickly followed one of the daughter of the famous modern astrologer, Dane Rudhyar, or may have been his wife, and she said in relation to this cycle that it refers to the dissolution, Neptune, of whatever's become negatively crystallized, Saturn. So this would be pertaining to Russia. So that's what's wrapped up in this cycle. It's going to be emphasized at the square, but it's definitely going to come to a head at the conjunction. And you know what, Steve? I think we're actually kind of getting close to the end here, aren't we, brother?
Actually, Stephen, sadly we are. But I want to say I really enjoyed this subject because it's very interesting, and the chart is a fascinating one. And I'm really excited that we've given a demonstration of horror astrology to our listeners, because if my memory serves me correctly, we haven't covered it before.
I'm sorry?
If my memory serves me correctly, we haven't used horror astrology very much at all for the show, so I'm really pleased that we've done a show using this great tool.
It's great. It's wonderful stuff. I use it routinely in my practice, Steve. It's a great effect. I love it. And it's, it's got quite a long tradition and very complex, very complicated, but it's good.
Yeah, but so useful, so insightful. Well, we'll see, won't we, in time. I'm sure we'll be hearing about developments this year with France and the sale or potential, or should we say probable sale of this warship to Russia. Sure, we'll be able to look back and consider how accurate our interpretation was, which is always great. And we have said that this year we wanted to do far more predictive work, and we'll be talking about how we plan to do that in future. But yeah, really, really great show, Stephen, and we'll be back again next week with another show, obviously. And I wanted to ask you, Stephen, if there's anything you want to share with listeners before we close, if you've got any research or any particular activities you want people to know about. They know always to find you at thegingerpsychic.com. If they want to book a consultation, you've got your great blogs going on there as well, lots of other things. So say what you want to say to our listeners.
Absolutely. Like you said it all, Steve. We specialize in predictive astrology. So now's the time of year. Call us up, book an appointment, and let's get the forecasting going. Finances, love, career, vocational questions, spiritual issues. No matter what, we can work out a forecast for you throughout the year that is accurate. And I just want to say thanks, Steve. It's been a great show. I enjoyed myself, and I want to wish everyone a happy week. See y'all next Friday.
Yes, thank you. Wish you a wonderful weekend, and we'll be back same time next week with more information. Please tell your friends about the show. Feel free to share the links on Facebook and through Twitter, etc. And remember that our shows are available on Blog Talk Radio, but they're also available on YouTube, and we'll be making them available to other channels as well shortly. So more on that in a week or two. Thank you.